We know what we want in life. We look at this and say, this right here is what I'm aiming for. Now, how do I get from here to there and accomplish what I want to accomplish? Whether it be in my life, in my home, in my family, at work, at school, in the church. What are we looking for? Well, my message today centers around the events of the 17th chapter of Exodus. And honestly, I'm not going to be finishing this morning. I will be continuing it tonight. I have the outline for all of it on the back of the bulletin. However, we're only going to be getting through a couple of those this morning. Let me begin before we start our reading. William Carey. William Carey is known as the father of modern day missions. He is the founder of what later became known as the Baptist Missionary Society, and that in itself would be considered as the great-great-granddaddy of our Southern Baptist Convention. William Carey worked very diligently as a missionary, and if you know much anything about William Carey, you know that he served many years in India as a missionary and is known for his work with all the Bible translations to the people in that land. He is also known for all the souls that he's witnessed to, that he has shared his faith with. And as a result, those souls came to know and experience the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. When I look at William Carey's life, when I study him, I see he was a man that took the Great Commission very seriously. His life and his work and his ministry centered around that. It meant something to him. Does the Great Commission mean much to us today? You know, I'm going to be going off to Brazil. And by the way, the 2 Sundays that I am going to be gone, the Sunday mornings, Dwayne is going to be covering for me. I have not yet determined what all we're going to be doing on a Sunday night. There's going to be one Sunday night that I plan on being gone. But thankfully, you all as a church voted, and I had no idea, to take care of a great portion of that expense. And I really do appreciate that. Not sure I could have made it otherwise. But I say that to say the reason that was done is because I believe you have a conviction on missions and ministering and caring and sharing about the love of Christ. William Carey had a statement that I've come to love and appreciate, and I have titled my message by this: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Now, in our text today, we'll be looking at an individual, another man that we've come to know and love as somebody that had some strong convictions. It was Moses. Moses could say this very same thing: expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. Moses had seen the awesome power of God at work in ways that we could even begin to fathom or imagine. He had seen the burning bush. He had seen the plagues in Egypt. He actually witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. He heard these promises from God. He heard the promise that Israel would be a land that was flowing with milk and honey. He heard when God promised to protect, to lead, to guide, to care for, to make sure that they prospered. He told them that they would be a blessed nation. He had seen God's power. He had heard the promises from God. And he expected God to be faithful because he knew that when God promised something, God was going to fulfill that. He knew that God could do great things. God had promised to do great things. And he was convicted and convinced that God would indeed do great things. He wasn't afraid. he wasn't afraid to attempt great things for God. Let's look at a little bit of the history here as we get into this passage. Israel's first battle in the wilderness is taking place right here. Joshua and the Israelites are going to fight their very first battle as God's chosen nation. And he is preparing them. He's preparing them for battle. He's preparing them for the blessings that await them. And God works in such a dramatic way as he had so many other times before and as he continues to do. But he was working in such a dramatic way to show them that through God we can attempt to do great and mighty things. Now here they are engaging in battle. War is not easy, especially when the whole world is up against you. Or maybe I should say you're up against the whole world. And that's the way the Israelites felt. God had given them a land. And he told them, you have to conquer all the nations that are currently living there in this land. And there's dozens upon dozens of nations that were there. And many of them were much larger and more militarily equipped to fight battle. It was a great challenge. It was a great accomplishment. I'm sure there was a lot of fear. Can we even begin to do this? But Moses, as their leader, and others that we'll see here, attempted to do God's will. Let me just pause for a moment. Where are you in life? Where are you in your own walk in life? Where are you in your own relationship to the Lord? Are you attempting to seek the Lord's will? When's the last time you said? When's the last time you prayed? Lord, show me your will. Lord, help me to do your will. Help me, Lord, to know your will. Do we wake up in the morning with that desire to know and understand God's will? And through his leadership and guidance, through his strength, through his blessings, be able to do and fulfill and accomplish what his will is in our lives? Whatever God's will is. I can tell you God's will for our church, among other things, but certainly God's will for our church is to reach lost people and bring people to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. It's God's will that we further equip ourselves for ministry, to get into God's Word, to understand God's Word, to be the people that we are to be. I could go down a whole long list of things that I know is God's will. But for your own individual lives, that makes it more specific. And that's where you need to have a relationship with him to understand what God's will is for you. Are we attempting to do great things for God? In your own life, in your home, in your family, in our church. What are we attempting to do that will be great things above and beyond the mediocre things? Things that we can step back and say only God can do something like that. What are we attempting to do in the way of great things? How do we do that? We do it the very same way that we see Moses doing it right here. We do the exact same thing that we see the Israelites, who were supposed to be doing what was seemingly impossible, knowing that there was a God working behind the scenes that was working in a tremendous way. Conquering all the nations of the promised land was not going to be an easy task. Okay, looking back at this ancient battle scene, there's a pattern going on right here. And I think when we look at today and continue tonight, is a pattern that we need to emulate in our own lives. And we need to understand that if we're going to accomplish these great things for God, we need to see the pattern that was unfolding right here. In verses 8 and 9 of the 17th chapter of Exodus, we see these words. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel. I think I would use the preposition there, against, rather than with. Against Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand at the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. One of those versions that I read today or this week, it didn't say the staff of God. It said the rod of God. That might be King James. I like that. The rod of God. And that's what I'm going to be referring to it as this morning. God clearly called Moses to be the leader of his people. God clearly called Moses to be the leader there in Israel. Remember how it happened? Moses was an Israelite. I find this quite interesting. You need to know this. He was an Israelite that was born into Egyptian captivity. He was an Israelite, but he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. And when he saw how Egypt was oppressing its people, it made him quite angry. In fact, he took matters into his own hands, and some of you will know that he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite on a particular occasion, and he looked around to make sure no one was looking, and what happened? He killed that Egyptian. Now notice something else going on here. We all know the story of Moses. We grew up with the story of Moses. We're familiar with that. If you've been in Sunday school or vacation Bible school at all, you know something about Moses. We know that God had a marvelous plan for Moses, and God used Moses in a tremendous way. But the problem was God had not yet called him. And Moses is attempting to do great things, but he's attempting to do great things on his own, depending upon himself and his own strength and his own abilities. It was God's plan for Moses to lead the Israelites out of bondage into the promised land. That was his will. It was Moses' desire to rescue the Israelites out of bondage. But God had not yet called him, at least at this point, to do this. So Moses was acting on his own. Okay, we'll step back just a moment. Have you ever done things on your own? Acted on your own? Done things without the proper leadership and guidance? Have you done that? See, Moses would say, yeah, I did that. And guess what? It cost me. You know, when we do things on our own, without the proper leadership and guidance, it's going to cost us. Now, it cost him 40 years of significance there in the Midian desert. It cost the Israelites 40 years of captivity. But then we see where God calls him. He calls him out of a burning bush. We've talked about that. We preached about that before. But at that time, Moses isn't quite as excited and into it as he had been. Maybe he'd gotten into that little comfort zone and was nestled in there. See, the plight of the Israelites wasn't as fresh on his mind and in his heart as it had been in the past. See, first we see Moses is ready to go out and jump on top of the world. He's ready to jump ahead, a jump ahead of God's calling. But now, God is ready to call, and Moses isn't quite as eager, rolling up his sleeves and jumping in full force. But if you know the rest of the story, you know that after wrestling with God's call, Moses finally submitted to God's call upon his life. And God gave him a sign of his calling. It was a sign of authority. He gave him that rod. And I'm sure that rod was probably a simple shepherd's staff, but it was a symbol. It was a symbol of the power of God on Moses' life. It served as a constant reminder of God's presence, God's power, God's authority upon his life. Anytime Moses attempted something for God, he had that rod as a reminder of God's calling and God's strength and God's presence and God's provision. Now I picture him as it is told here in the 17th chapter. He stood there on top of that hill overlooking the battlefield. And he has this rod in his hand. It was a constant reminder that the only reason I am here doing what I am doing is because it is God's will. It's God's calling upon me. Now again, let's just step back a moment. Let's just think about what's unfolding here. Is there something in this scene that God could possibly be speaking to us and saying to our hearts and minds? What has God called you to do? I mean, is it possible that you can come here Sunday after Sunday and God never had any calling upon your life? Is there some purpose? Is there some plan? Is there some way that God wants to use you in line with his will for the advancement of his cause and kingdom? Now, one thing for sure, I may not know what God is calling you to do, but I can tell you what he's not calling you to do. He's not calling you to do nothing. Well, that's a double negative, okay? Teachers, school professionals, forgive me. I just like the way that sounds, okay? He's not calling us to just sit here and do nothing. Although some have gotten pretty nestled in just doing nothing. And we need to be reminded that we cannot act on our own. Now, if we're seeking God's leadership, then we've got to be submissive and obedient to his leadership. We must act under the authority and under the power that he has given us. Now, there's a second thing that I see here. This comes from verses 10 and 11 in this same chapter. There must be that dependency on God. We've got to be dependent on God. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. Okay, remember, he held up his hand. He's got that rod. We'll call it the rod of God. He's got that rod in his hand. Whenever Moses lifted up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he lowered his hand, the enemy prevailed. Now, there's something to be said about what's taking place right here. In order to attempt great things for God. And this is a great event that's taking place there. We can read this and just slide right over it and not even realize the impact. Joshua is that commander on the battlefield. And we see Moses as being that intercessor. And we see that rod as a symbol of God's power, the symbol of God's authority, the symbol of God's calling. And it is lifted up in front of the people, acknowledging that Moses is who he is and is able to do what he's doing, as well as these other leaders, because God is being honored and God is being glorified. So what happened here? If you've read ahead, then you may know. There was victory. They were victorious over the enemy. Their attempt was not successful. When? The rod was not elevated. When the rod was not lifted up. When the rod was allowed to be lowered in the eyes of the people, what happened? The enemy prevailed. What do we want for our lives, folks? Do we want to come out victorious in our own lives? Or do we want to be defeated? And we see the options there. And basically we know what we need to do in order to achieve either one of those. Their attempt at great things had failed when they lowered that rod before the people. And God places, and again, we want to step back again, just sort of soak this in. Okay, what are you saying, Lord? What's coming about in this event right here? See, God places calls upon our lives. He's got a will and he's got a plan for every one of us. I don't care who we are. For I've already said, whatever God's will for you is, it's not to just sit and do nothing. God places calls upon our own individual lives. It's what I need to be doing with my life. What you may need to be doing in your home. What you maybe need to be doing at work. And even to the church. When we lift up that call, when we lift up that rod of God and allow others to see what God is doing and recognize the power that is before us and the power that is within us, because we recognize Him and His presence and His authority, that we can be victorious. One of your favorite passages of Scripture, and one of my favorite passages, comes from Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. If you've memorized any passages, I'm sure that's one of them. I can do all things through Christ, which strengthens me. I've told you this before. Whether you remember it or not, I'm not sure. Properly translated, what Philippians 4:13 says, there's nothing that you and I cannot do without God's strength and God's power upon our lives. It's not a matter of me doing it. It's not a matter of you doing it. It's a matter of us being able to do it coupled with the strength and the authority and the power of God in our lives. When we hold up God's glory and honor before His people, God can use us in powerful ways. See, we can expect great things from God when we attempt to do great things for Him. But now we let that rod down, and what happens? We're powerless. We're not victorious. Now how does that happen? Well, we let the flesh get in the way. We let our own desires get in the way. We can find ourselves being so distracted by the things of the world that we're no longer holding up the banner. We've let it down. In the process of doing that, we're losing. We're losing the battle. We're failing. When we lower that rod of God for God's glory and God's honor. And what happens when we lower that, rather than elevate it, we're elevating other things. We're elevating our own will, our own desires, our own pleasures. And again, we cannot come out victorious. Mark it down. Eventually, you lose. So if we look back at the history of most churches. Now, in all fairness, I grew up in the Catholic Church, as some of you know. I was an altar boy, but I never really understood a whole lot of that and never got into the real politics of the church. But I've been in church as an adult. Over the years, I've been in a lot of them. I have been on staff with a few of them. I have talked with many, many pastors and church leaders over the years. I've led some conferences. I've been in conferences that others have led. So I understand the church and see the thing that's going on in the church, I think, to a reasonable degree. And you know what I've noticed? In so many churches, it's like it's a roller coaster experience. Up and down, up and down. Our attendance can be up and down. Your relationship with the Lord can be up and down. Your commitment to the Lord is up and down. It's like a roller coaster. You know, in preparation of this sermon, I couldn't help but think about this. I think about days in looking back at the history of this church. You know, we've got stacks of record books going back from 1836. And you look at the revivals that took place. You know, I would just love to be a part of a revival where we have so many people in the presence. We couldn't get them all in the church. They had to open up the windows. People in horses and buggies standing on the outside of the walls listening. They didn't have microphones either. Oh, some heydays in the church. You know, I think about since I've been here. I can remember before we went to the early service. You know, we had to go to the early service because we were putting folding chairs out to get everybody in. And now it's like we're begging people to be a part of the church. I had breakfast the other morning with two other pastors. They were voicing the same thing in their own churches. You know, what's happened? You know, we've taken the rod of God that we used to hold so proudly to glorify God, to honor God, and now we've lowered it down. And we're lifting up other things, our own desires, our own wishes. I don't see where God is glorified in that, folks. We're not going to come out victorious. We're just not going to be winners. See, there's been some wonderful times in the life of all of our churches where God has prevailed. And I give him the glory for that, particularly those where I've been involved, right here where you've been involved. But there's also been times when the Amalekites have come out victorious. So who is it that's winning in our own lives, in our own relationship with the Lord, our own battles that we're fighting? Are we lifting up the rod of God? Or have we lowered it and lifting up other things? You know, it's interesting why some people just get alienated away from the church. No, they just don't want to be a part of that. Maybe it's something that was said a long time ago. Maybe 30, 40 years ago, but they never got over it. Or it could be because you came and you sat in somebody's seat. How dare her sit in my seat? But that's not the big issues. You know, when things like that happen, I've come to realize that we have lost our focus. We can focus on trivial things that really don't matter. And we can make up all kinds of excuses. I preached about 3 sermons on excuses and probably could come up with 3 more pretty easily. Excuses. But when we lose the focus, and our focus must be on God and God alone. Not me, not I, not us, but God alone. And what God can do in our own lives, in our churches, in our community, the changes that God can take place in your own homes. And I'm here to tell you, there's a world of homes where God needs to be lifted up. And he's not. And because he's not lifted up and he's being lowered, other things are being elevated that don't glorify God. And guess what? There's no victory there. You come out a loser. Well, I can guarantee you one thing. Every time the Amalekites prevail in our churches today, God's glory is not being lifted up as it should be. And we need to be attempting in everything that we do to lift up that rod of God, to glorify him in everything that we do, so that we can indeed make a difference. So, what are you doing? Are you expecting great things for God? Are you attempting great things for God? See where God is in your life. Do we elevate the rod of God? Or we've got other things, the personal agenda. We don't come out winners there. After everything is said and done, you won't be a winner. See, Moses is up to something here, and God is up to something in Moses' life. We'll try to carry that out a little bit more tonight. Let's pray.